Okay, I think this is usually when it's live and it doesn't tell me. Okay, so I'm going to open this by saying today that I'm talking about talking with gods, or sort of tuning into archetypes. I'm wanting to, my mind wants to give a lot of context for this, but I think I mean something that is, I get the impression that a lot of people know what this is, but they're just not consciously used to thinking of it in this way. So there's, hi Rupert, thank you. Yeah, so what I'm, so part of the reason this is alive for me, I want to give a little context about where I'm coming from for this. So lately I've been having a lot of conversations with people, and most of them have been, they amount to variations of, which God do you need to talk to? the like there's a whole thing about explaining the context for that. This is coming from the the alchemical community that I've been part of, where they're using like Jungian approach to alchemy in order to do internal transformation. But there's a noticing my mind keeps getting jammed as I start to talk about all of these things. A few days ago, I had so just stumbling around. Keep noticing my mind keeps trying to start and then try on a different angle here, and I'm noticing a lot of kind of embarrassment about that. So what I'm looking at is how there's a certain way that I experience in the style. I've used music as an example a number of times. This way that when music is playing, it feels a particular way in my body. And I use body loosely there. There's definitely a location thing. It's happening in my heart and in my stomach. But the sensation that's defining something as hip hop or as jazz or as metal is somehow more subtle than just does it vibrate in a particular way? Does it have a certain rhythm? There's a feel to it. So there's this way where when so Carl Jung, a psychologist from the early to mid 20th century, would reference archetypes, which are meant to be these big arching background things. These are, in some sense, concepts that are driving people in the background. Like mother is a very, it's an old shape. Like archetype literally means old shape or old form. And it's something that sort of shapes how people are behaving in the background. But when I'm feeling into what I think Jung was talking about, I think he means something that's very similar to this flavor that I get off of music. There's something about this, a kind of energy that happens in my body that can stimulate the body again, but there's something that happens in the body, in the energetic system. There's something that I notice happening. Like if I'm, like right now, I'm feeling a little squirmish. Like there's a little bit of squirmishness going on. There's a sense of, well, I wanted to show up for doing lives each day, and there's a host of topics that I was thinking of jumping in on, and I'm trying not to decide with my mind. I'm trying to tune into something. What does tuning into something mean? Well, that's part of what I'm trying to stumble around describing. What is this tuning in? Well, when I'm feeling the agitation and my mind is getting in the way, part of what's going on is there's a sensation. For me, it's usually going on around the belly button. It kind of bubbles up, and then my thoughts start to rev in response to that particular bubbling up. I can call that worry. I can call it like fear. I can call it activation. I can call it all kinds of different things, but I only call it something after my mind tries to define what the sensation is. There's already the sense. There's already this sort of energetic welling up that fuels my thinking. So, to some extent, ignoring the thoughts and paying attention to the feeling in the body starts to tune into something. I start to notice, well, this is what's going on. So when I hear music of a particular sort, there's a ringing in my body. So, so in terms of this allows for a type of conversation. There's like a type of language that I find that happens at that level. There's a little bit. Interesting. My hair's just flaring out right there. Oh well. There's this. I keep finding it a little bit tricky to describe because descriptive language is exactly what that isn't. But for instance, I went to an ayahuasca retreat down in Peru. This would have been in April of 2018. No, 2019. Sorry, April 2019. And my experiences there matched a lot of the reports that I heard of people having a sort of interaction with the spirit of ayahuasca. If you listen to a lot of the reports that people have of interacting with this plant medicine, it's basically a psychedelic, but it's like in a particular ceremonial setting, and it's done with a kind of a sort of seriousness, a tone of, okay, well, let's actually take a look at this. There's a there's a tone of people talking about it as though the medicine itself is intelligent. Like the ayahuasca vine has an intent. A lot of people talk about going to ayahuasca retreats or ceremonies because Mama Aya called them. And they'll often create this sort of mythos around this, the plant being a spirit, and the spirit is Mama Ayahuasca. And she is a teacher with a certain kind of personality, and she has a sort of trickster nature to her, but she's not there to trick you. It's more like it's a little flavored trickster, sort of like if you those who are familiar with the mythos, if you sort of merge Mercury and Kali, you get something that's a little bit like Mama Aya. But this is something like the way that minds make sense of what the experience is on the medicine. Inside the experience, there's I see Rupert's mentioning this early experiences with cannabis. I sometimes thought in terms of there being an intelligent spirit in the herb while intoxicated. Yeah. So it sounds like you have some sense of the direction I'm going in here. So when I was in there, I did a total of, I think it was 5 ceremonies, if I remember right. There was, in each one, there would be this experience of course, there'd be this weird sort of intoxicating effect. Calling it intoxicated is, like, if you've never experienced anything like this, if you think of it a little bit like getting drunk, that's like about as close as it's going to get. That there's definitely getting into an altered space. And then there's a way where there's a quality like the thing, the energy, the frequency, whatever that is welling up and transforming the lived experience of the environment and of the mind. Like that energy has something that you could almost call intent. Now, this is not a claim about what is objectively true. It's a description of the lived experience of encountering this. My lived experience of encountering this. A number of people have had similar experiences on all kinds of different substances. A lot of people that I've talked to who are involved in all kinds of plant medicines, including ones that have no psychedelic effects, insist that there is a way to have this kind of interaction with the spirit of any plant. They'll talk about getting familiar with the spirit of mugwort or the spirit of cinnamon. Okay? And there's this whole tradition. There's this whole arc that like Peruvian shamans will go through, where it's about developing a personal relationship with these spirits. Okay? The practice I'm thinking of is called a dieta. In a dieta for at least the Peruvian shamans that I had talked to down there, there's a practice of doing something that's borderline fasting, eating very bland foods, avoiding getting exposure to things that are of strong resonance. If you have no idea what I mean when I'm talking about these energies, like you think about, I mean, I bet most people do. It's just a lot of people are not familiar with talking this way and have not cultivated a lot of conscious, subtle awareness of these experiences. But it's the same feeling as, well, like if you listen to some music, it moves you, it makes emotions happen, right? Or at the very least, it makes your foot start tapping. It starts to get your body to want to move. I'm imagining, I'm saying you're, and I'm projecting here, but I think this is a pretty universal human experience. So what that means is if you're trying to notice a really subtle emotion, and then you put on something that is just bombastic and loud and really grips you and gives you the sense of, yes, like we're going to march forward, like something with strong drums and trumpets and so on. Like if that can overwhelm any kind of sense of, wait, but wasn't I feeling this subtle little delicate emotion, and where was that? Like it just gets knocked out. So like, hopefully that makes some sense. The idea of a dieta is to avoid loud music, and that includes literal loud music. And you're trying to avoid really moving pieces of music. There's often a sense of like you just don't listen to music on a dieta. You eat very bland food. The reason is strong tastes have a resonance. They move things in the body, and including in the subtle body here. This the same level as emotions and the like little glimpses of intuitions. So they'll often also avoid interacting with other people too much. Sometimes the shaman will go out into the jungle and just by themselves in their own little hut and just spend weeks or months. Bland food, meditating, and being with the plant that they're trying to get familiar with, and often taking it in, making teas out of it, or just meditating on it, like burning it and smelling the fumes of it, just so that the main frequency that they're tuning into, that they're feeling, is of that plant. So it becomes very easy to know, okay, that right there, that is the resonance of dandelion. Like I mean, in Peru, they're not going to do dandelion, but they would do this with stuff like mapacho, which is their term for tobacco. And I would do this in order to really get familiar with what is mapacho like? What is his personality? And there's a tendency to like assign, there's a general trend towards personification with rough clusters of tending towards genders. So for the most part in the Peruvian, like the Shipibo people, if I remember right, Mapacho is definitely a very masculine spirit in how they culturally conceive of him. And Mama Ayahuasca is definitely feminine. And part of that is a resonance with the idea that the feminine takes you a lot deeper into the spiritual realms and into the unknown. And that has to do with their associations with the gender dynamics. But the important part here is the personification. There's something about meeting a being by tuning into this resonance. I'm under the impression that there was something similar going on with, for instance, the Oracle at Delphi. So this gets right into the roots of Western traditions here. The Oracle at Delphi would supposedly channel Apollo. And it sounds like she would do so by getting high on fumes from under the ground. But it wasn't just getting high on fumes and she babbles. It's important that there was a ceremonial setting. There was a whole context where you go through a sort of appeal to meet the oracle. And she is treated in a particular way, providing a particular context. I honestly don't know most of the context there. But it's not just arbitrary. It's not like, oh, hey, let's just sniff some vapors from under the ground. It's setting an aesthetic tone that creates a certain kind of resonance, that sort of makes a certain frequency especially loud, so that when she gets intoxicated, this is what's dominant in her environment. Timothy Leary in the 1960s put a big emphasis on this in terms of set and setting. He was talking about, he's one of the fathers of the, or leaders or something like that, but he's very closely associated with and moving the psychedelic revolution of the 1960s. Set and setting is talking about mindset and your physical and, I would also say energetic setting of what is the context you are in when you're going into taking something like LSD. And he was pushing the specific LSD in order to encourage world awakening and so on, which is one of the reasons why it was made illegal in the United States. Whereas you have things like alcohol, which is blatantly more biologically dangerous and dangerous to other people, but is perfectly fine, but we'll ignore that. So but this business about set and setting, like the reason for it is that, like, so if someone goes into an experience with a psychedelic with an attitude of, I'm going to enter this with reverence, and I'm going to see what I can learn from this for my own growth and to expand my capacity to love. And if somebody comes in with that, and they're in an environment with a lot of people who are holding that kind of space and making it something that's sort of a kind of somber, no, sorry, somber isn't the word I'm looking for, but a kind of, it's attended to. Okay, it's something that's consciously held, then it's much more likely that the person is actually going to experience on the psychedelic something that gives them a kind of insight that is about how they can love better and how they can show up, whatever it was that had them asking the spiritual question in the first place. Whereas if they're hanging out with a bunch of people who they don't quite trust or feel comfortable with, and they're in some person's living room, and they just say, hey, do you want to pop a tab? And you want to look cool, and you want to be welcomed into their group, but you're feeling kind of uneasy, and then you pop the psychedelic, the chances are quite good that you're going to have a very negative experience, because it's not going to feel safe, and that lack of safety is something that will become very loud in the experience. So that's the kind of thing that Leary was talking about with set and setting. I'm going to connect that to the Peruvian stuff in a moment. Rupert says, the Netherlands is such an enlightened society. Yeah, it's funny. I've been to the Netherlands twice, and I managed to somehow completely miss this dimension of their culture both times I was there. But I was there as a teenager. So, so in some sense, chaperoned both times. So it's not too surprising. Yeah, I've also heard. I mean, I think Peru's Sacred Valley has a lot of really interesting stuff there, especially Pisac. Definitely like neo-hippie culture. A lot of Westerners from the Northern Hemisphere there. I don't know quite how it compares to Bali, but there's like this whole cluster of like spiritual tourist locations that have all kinds of really rich stuff in them. But anyway, that's a fun aside. I could go on for that for a while. So this business about set and setting, part of the reason that's the reason I'm highlighting that is that, like, there's such a similarity to Leary's thing about set and setting, what's going on with the, or what went on, I should say, with the Oracle at Delphi, and um, a lot of the context that's given for, well, like, I mean, I'll actually get to the Dieta and linking to the Dieta in a moment, but this is emphasizing a frequency. Actually, I'll just do it right now. It's emphasizing the frequency in the same way that the Dieta emphasizes a frequency. In some sense, they're opposite strategies in that the set and setting type stuff is saying, let's make the ceremonial context really clear. Like, you want to talk about love? All right, well, let's get together a bunch of people who are going to focus, take breaths together, and have a sense of we are all here in the name of love. We're here in the name of love. Yes, namaste, and that sets a tone that heightens a kind of, well, what am I tuning into? With the Dieta, instead of making a certain frequency loud, it's getting rid of everything else. So that the only, like, relatively speaking, the frequency that you want to test is loud. There's actually an interesting analogy that has nothing to do with, well, almost nothing to do with altered states of consciousness, where in what's called the elimination test for dietary sensitivities, where if you want to check to see if your body has some difficulty with some kind of food, a classic process for sorting this out is you completely eliminate it from your diet, 100%, absolutely no exceptions for 2 weeks. And then at the end of those 2 weeks, like, you notice how you feel. You maybe make some notes, maybe make a couple of 0 to 10, how bloated do I feel, or whatever, and you just track what your experience is. And then you spend 3 days having a lot of it. And so some people are concerned about, well, I think my body may have some difficulty with wheat, but I can't quite tell. It might be gluten. I don't know. Is gluten sensitivity even a thing? Some people say it's baloney. Other people swear by it. I don't know what's going on. Well, one way to see what's going on, which is like, it's still susceptible to placebo, but like this still gives a hint, is to eliminate all gluten from your diet for 2 weeks, and then 3 days of eating a lot of bread and pasta. Right? And then if there is something that your body is inclined to do, maybe by placebo, maybe because of a biological reaction, whatever, but if you're inclined to react to, I would say, that frequency, right? There's something to be said about how matter is a kind of high momentum frequency, but this gets into some ontological stuff that's not terribly key here. But that'll really make the experience loud if there is one. So you get to see, oh, okay, so that's what's going on for me. So I talk about all these things because when certain frequencies become really clear, it's very natural, for whatever reason. We can try to retrofit an explanation, but the lived experience is that frequency carries an intelligence. Like with Mama Ayahuasca. There's a sense of, oh, I thought I was going into this ayahuasca experience because I wanted to sort out this difficulty that I have with being awkward with people. But apparently Mama Ayahuasca has a different plan for me. When I went to my ayahuasca retreat, the facilitators said, ayahuasca is intelligent and understands that you have 5 ceremonies and is going to plan on that to account for how fast you need to go and what you can work through and what's important for you to work through. Now, and I did find something very much like that. There's a question of, well, how much of that was because it was framed to me versus some sort of intelligence in the plant? And there's an important way in which that doesn't matter. Because my sense is, for myself, I've had this sense of, if I can hold the recognition that I don't know what is true about the mechanism, I have some ideas, I have some guesses, I'm not totally ignorant, but if I don't need to believe one thing or the other, I can just benefit from the experience itself. And then it is possible to have something like a conversation at an energetic level. So when I was in these ceremonies and I would be talking to Mama Aya, it's as though the thing that arises in me that's shifting my consciousness around, and in two cases actually shoved my consciousness right outside of time. It's a if you've never had this experience, this probably just sounds incredibly alien. There, there's in retrospect, what happened was I lost the capacity to access anything like short-term memory, but I was apparently recording memories just fine, so I'm able to remember the experience perfectly well. But everything had this flickering nature to it because I couldn't remember what I was just doing or what I was just thinking. But on the inside, the experience is there is no time, as in time doesn't exist. There isn't even time to sort that out and figure it out because there isn't enough time to put chains of thought together. So there's just this moment and this moment and this moment and this moment. And it's very disorienting. But I didn't choose to go there. It felt sort of like she moved me there. So after a while, I started to sense what it is in me that feels like her operating. And I got a sense of what her flavor is like. That's why I can say, Mama Ayahuasca is sort of the South American Kali. Not everybody experiences her that way, but that's how I experienced her. And there was a kind of coherence to her. So in that sense, I claim that there is this, I think this is general. I don't think there's something special and weird about me that is uniquely capable of doing this. I think this is the same thing that people talk about when they pick up on, like when someone isn't themselves, they're not acting like themselves. It's not just, oh, your behavior doesn't fit the set of behaviors I'm familiar with. Like sometimes somebody can be very spontaneous and very strange, but it still feels like them. Maybe an energetic version of them, but it feels like them. But if they're doing something that doesn't fit, it's something like they're wearing an energy, they're wearing some kind of frequency or something that is not the kind of frequency that they usually put out, that you usually associate with them. I know that we don't consciously generally think of it this way, but I'm pretty sure this is actually what we're talking about. There's this way in which you're playing the wrong genre of music for you. Your music doesn't usually sound like this. It doesn't have me feeling this way when I listen to the song of you. And I'm pretty sure there's something very much like that going on. So I mentioned this because, so over the last, I don't know, week or so now, I keep having conversations with people that are, it largely feels like I'm telling them what God they need to talk to. And an awful lot of it is I have a conversation with them about some curiosities, and I'm using pieces of Hermetic philosophy for this. If it turns out to make sense sometime in the next 90-ish days, I'll probably go into this, since this has become surprisingly central as one of my main tools for navigating how to construct meaning, which is different from saying I believe in it. It's like, oh, here's a tool set. Cool. But anyway, that's its whole story, its own story. And I'd be interacting with somebody and talking with them about what some of the challenges are that they're experiencing, and what some of their hopes and dreams are. And just sort of get a feel for what the energetic tone is that they're bringing and what some of the threads are. And for the most part, for these, because of something in Hermetic philosophy, I mostly use the 7 classic planetary deities. It's a little bit like if you wanted to make music, it's helpful to know what the 7 notes are of a scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and to be able to play them. And the 7 classical deities are where we get the names. Well, yes, it is where we get the names, but our 7 days of the week actually come from this same place. and that's the sun, like Sunday, the moon, Monday, Mars, in French this is mardi, Tuesday. Wednesday is Woden's Day or Odin's Day, and Odin corresponds to Mercury. So in French, you'll find it being called mercredi. So it's Mercury's day. Thursday, Thor's Day. Thor is thought to match up with Jupiter. So in French, it's jeudi. Freya's Day, Friday, corresponding to Venus, which, because of weird linguistic spinning, the fact that in Latin, saying of Venus or Venuses, the ownership form of Venus is Veneris, and then somehow French stuck a D in there, so it ends up being vendredi, and then Saturday for Saturn. So those are the 7 planetary deities: the sun, the moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. There's a way in which those 7 are really deeply embedded in a lot of the tone of Western culture, but we don't talk about it anymore because it's not part of our mythos. Like it's part of our ancient mythos, but we think of it as things that those Romans thought of, and occasionally you'll hear some modern folk talking about this, mostly astrologers. Although the astrologers are not very consistent about referring to them as planetary deities, from what I've been able to tell. They talk about them sort of like energies or a kind of influence, and they mix it in with a bunch of others that have nothing to do with Hermetic philosophy. And definitely nothing having to do with the days of the week or the way that we structure time. So I'll be talking with people about these and sort of sorting out, well, what kind of chord is going to help unlock things for you? And for me, it's a playful co-puzzle. We're sort of working together to find, well, okay, how would this work for you? There's a couple of steps of this process, but a really big one is pretty consistently. There's usually one specific note that is like the dominant note that it seems like, oh, this is going to resonate with your frequency in a way that I think is going to create some neat unfolding for you. Now, all of this is working with consciousness. Like it's helpful. I find it helpful. There's a little bit of dirt in my heart here. I do, in fact, think that it is helpful to be able to take a step back, and a part of me is wanting to take a step back and explain some context because I don't want to be seen as crazy mystical. On the other hand, I do seem to be pretty mystical at this point. I don't think I'm crazy, but very few people think they're I actually believe that they are crazy, from what I can tell. So maybe I am a not-so-mystic, trying to control people's perception of me. I want to let that go. That's not a frequency I want to live, and it sullies my communication. It sullies my own relationship to myself, more importantly. It makes it harder for me to be clear with myself about what I mean. But there is a thing that I think is, in fact, important, and that's stepping back and recognizing. We're talking about all of these different frequencies and tuning in and bringing in resonance of gods and all of that. Is it real? Is this describing something about how the world really works? I mean, come on, we're talking about gods. Some people just buy into it. And some people insist, no, it's just a metaphor. It's just an interface for the consciousness. There's a really important level at which we don't know. This can lean towards philosophy, but and I think the philosophy matters. I think it matters for the mind to be clear about this. But more important than the mind being clear is the reason for seeking the clarity. There's a realness to these experiences. When we talk about whether something rings with truth, we're talking about a kind of what we might as well call a vibration or a frequency or an energy. It's something felt at this level that I keep wanting to talk about. Okay. This is another case where I do mean myself. I'm slipping a little bit in that. It is something that I experience that way. And I really, really often hear people talk about this, so this is another one of those things that I in fact think is general. But it's definitely true of me. I definitely experience it at this kind of energetic, subtle level. There's definitely a vivid thing there. When I'm talking about, oh, this rings true. Okay, well, rings where? It's funny that we use this metaphor of rings true. So the, yeah, I see Rupert. Rupert says, I have difficulty letting go of the physicalist paradigm. Yeah, I, for me, it's been a bit of a struggle too. And for me, there's something here about, there's something really, I found that there's something incredibly important about recognizing that the, as you put it, the physicalist paradigm, the sort of scientific materialist paradigm, is an idea. And if I am looking at it in terms of, oh, there are these laws of physics, there is a physical world here, and it's bumping around, and it produces a brain that that does these computations, and that is what I am. That's a story. It's an idea. That doesn't mean it's false, but I'm pretty sure the question of whether it's true or not is a very confused one. I do know that the physicalist paradigm is really useful. It's super useful. Okay? And being willing to let go of the need to relate everything to it. I can still make an effort. I can still enjoy that and trying to make sense of things within the physicalist paradigm. But letting go of the need, like, oh, this, I can't actually experience the god Jupiter unless I can have an interpretation that lets me make sense of why it works in physics. Why? Like, the experience is available. So if for some weird reason I cannot find any way to link it into physics, what that tells me is my understanding of physics is importantly incomplete, because it's not explaining a piece of my experience. All of my understanding of the physicalist paradigm comes through my experience. So if I am going to prioritize the physicalist paradigm, like the model of physics, over my own experience, then I have a really curious loop in a way that actually makes it harder for me to use the physics perspective in a clean and clear way. And that's what I find. So my comment here is, I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that physics is wrong. I'm saying that the question of whether physics is right or wrong is itself a confused question coming from a place that's not relevant when it comes to recognizing the nature of how conscious experience interacts with the world. Whatever it means that those two sound different when I talk about them. Okay. So I don't know if that helps. But for what it's worth, that's my own experience in navigating that puzzle. And I find that with practice, I actually, particularly if I have multiple paradigms I can switch between, you can sort of look around going, you know what, maybe this, like being able to don the flat earth perspective is kind of fun. Being able to live it. Like, this is, again, a frequency attunement thing. This is less like tuning into an intelligence. This is tuning into a world. But there's something funny that happens when I'm looking off in the distance and I can see the horizon stretching out. And then I do a frame shift that's not just, you know, some people think that the Earth is flat, and they're arguing that, like, the South Pole is actually this giant ice wall going around the Earth. And, like, I don't believe that. I mean, that doesn't make very good predictions. It doesn't make any better predictions than the standard model does, as far as I can tell. But I can sort of move myself into the flat earth world, which is different from having thoughts of some people believe that. It's looking at the terrain and then looking at it with sort of pretending as if, oh, the world is flat and this is the dome of the sky. The dome of the sky is an actual dome. Okay? And like making that kind of shift, if I can pop into that world, it's a lived experience. Another version is when I look at the dome of the sky, like I think like I've got this cute model of, well, according to the physics model, my brain is somehow creating the impression of the physical world. So everything I'm experiencing is actually in my mind. So there's a cute trick to do, which is like, it's not very honest to the framing, but it works anyway. I find it works, which is to imagine the dome of the sky as the inside edge of my skull. So this literally is in my head. Like, it's absurd, but I find that doing that shift creates a kind of pop. And if I can pop into that world, the lived experience of what all of this means changes. And so the ability to do that requires that I be willing to loosen my grip on any one paradigm, regardless of how useful it is. It's just this question of, well, how can I shift frames? How can I experience the world in these different ways? I think that's a tremendous, I mean, it's definitely fun. It's very fun. Okay? It's like a meaning-making superpower. Right? It's like the ability to travel between lived worlds. But it's also super duper useful for empathy. For being able to slip into the same world that someone else is normally living in. I find that really helpful and enormously kind. And it's a lot easier to figure out how to bridge between worlds. This is one of the recurring. This is a frustration I'm learning how to let go of, but there's definitely a frustration sort of jammed in my system around the kind of arguments that happen between spiritual communities and scientific ones. Largely a lot of ignoring and sneering, because both are so certain about their lived world. It's a little absurd from my perspective, because you can live in either one. But I can understand the problem, particularly from the scientific angle, because the scientific cultures have all of this feedback of, but really the scientific view is correct. Right? That's the real world. Like, you can do all these other things if you want to, but here's why they're delusions. The real world is made of atoms, and, well, not really atoms, it's kind of quarks. Well, not really quarks, it's actually math. We won't ask where math comes from. Like, that's an uninteresting question, because you can't do experiments on math. That's something like we'll wave our hands. Doesn't matter. We can do experiments over here, and then we can build everything up, and we can see how it works. Yeah, we don't know how systems work, but we can build rockets, and we can make planes, and we can do nuclear fission, and this is coming from having models of the world, coming from understanding. That's great, right? And there's this sort of skipping over things like, well, where's the math from then? Where is the knowing that the math is right coming from? If you need to use the math to develop a model that talks about brains so that you can then describe where the math comes from, then you're in a really strange loop. So, I mean, oops. Yeah. I'm research active in philosophy of maths. Cool. Yeah, it might be interesting to have a conversation longer about that. But I'm getting a bit into the weeds here. It's related, but I want to talk a little bit more about these intelligences. There's something about So I've repeatedly, when invited people to pick one specific deity to attune to, and I'll give them some recommendations on how to attune to them. It largely follows the rough formula of the Oracle at Delphi minus the fumes. Right? Um, but there's a kind of there's like a whole bunch of coming up with a bunch of symbols that resonate in some sense, and then you sort of feel into it. My experience has been that when I grab enough of these symbols and I sort of feel into it and I let myself sort of loosen my mind a bit, there's a way where it's like playing a bunch of different instruments that are all trying to hit G. And you won't have all the instruments all exactly right, but they're all trying. And because they're all trying and they're all playing, when you sort of zoom out, the note you hear is G. So there's some kind of effect like that of getting the note that is that frequency. And when that happens, it feels a little bit like a personality comes through, just like with in interacting with ayahuasca. That an encounter with a personality, in my experience, feels in the body very similar to when I'm meeting a person and I'm getting to interact with them over video or in person, and I get a sense of who they are. And I might be surprised later, and it might turn out that I was projecting on them, but there's a flavor, there's a frequency, there's like a bunch of frequencies, it's more like a bunch of chords. The same thing seems to be going on with, if I'm tuning into Jupiter. What is tuning into Jupiter? What is that even? Well, Jupiter is connected with a whole bunch of archetypes related to sky gods and thunder gods. And a lot of the things of Santa Claus actually come from Jupiter's resonance. So in Hellenistic astrology, which is a fair bit different from the kind of astrology that's used today, but in the astrology that was used around the time when of like Alexander the Great's Egypt, they would say that this time of year, leading up to the winter solstice, is ruled by Jupiter. And, any opinions about psychiatric medication? I'll get to that in a moment. The short answer is not a lot of strong ones. I don't have a whole lot of experience with psychiatric medications. So in tuning into that kind of archetype, like I have guesses about what we could say is going on in terms of like, oh, well, everybody's carrying around a sort of copy of the resonance of this archetype. So like everybody has, like maybe an easier example would be the archetype of mother. What does it mean to talk to mother? Well, like, as far as I know, this is still true today. Maybe there are a few exceptions, but basically all humans have mothers. And this has been true for millions of years, since long, long before we had language or culture. So the imprint of, well, what does it mean to interact with mother? What is mother? Well, because I have a mother. When I think of mother, I'm inclined in part to think of my mom. But I also note that there are ways where mom isn't an exact fit for mother, the archetype of mother. So what am I feeling into? Well, that's some cultural ideas. These are some stereotypes. It's going to be different in different cultures. Yeah, maybe, probably. And I'm still tuning into something. So if I were to feel into what is mother, the archetype of mother, I sort of get this nurturing quality, like the word nurture has this kind of associations. Definitely feminine, but not predominantly erotic, but not devoid of eroticism either. It's like, yeah, like you, yeah, it's complicated, but it's complicated in a way that I can feel into. It's got a lot of nuance and a lot of like somehow meltiness and emotion end up feeling associated. so the like when I tune into that, I sort of what I'm tuning into is not just a bunch of ideas. It's not just random associations, and they're not even clustered associations. Those emerge second. There's this tuning into what is mother, and then I feel that in my body, and then I notice, well, it's a little bit like tuning a radio. What exactly is that feeling? And as I feel into it, there's a kind of lighting up that becomes possible. Now, in part because mother is such an old archetype and so vast, it doesn't have as coherent, well, she doesn't have as coherent a personality in my experience as compared to something like ayahuasca. But there's definitely a sense of but there's an intuition of, well, there are facets of mother, like the Virgin Mary has a lot of maternal aspects to her. There's a lot of emphasis on the virginity. There's like this huge emphasis on remove all of the sexuality, any of the sexual charge from mother, like remove it all, completely gone. And that's an important aspect of what it means to tune into the Virgin Mary. That's why it's an emphasis on virgin. You contrast this with stuff like Pachamama, the way that like the earth mother, the bountiful, fruitful mother. When you think of the literal ground as a being who is mother, it's a very different resonance from the Virgin Mary. But they both carry some of the flavors of mother. So noticing that we're now talking about splitting this into different pieces, when I do that kind of movement, so there's, I've been playing specifically with, well, what does it mean to tune into Gaia? Like the earth as a literal goddess, as though the earth is a conscious being. It's kind of a thought experiment, but the thought experiment invites something, the same way that thinking about ayahuasca as a being with intent, as a spirit, evokes something. So I can evoke something and feel into my body is actually made of Gaia. The ground under my feet is made of Gaia. My body before this body was my biological mother's. And so there's this reaching back in time. This is all dirt. This is all earth. So in some sense, my touching my own body, my putting my feet on the ground, my breathing the air, this is communing with Gaia. There's a kind of reverence that becomes possible, like I'm interacting with her. And then I can start to feel into, and then there's this, for me, what comes up is this tone of interacting with someone who is ancient and kind of jaded. There's a jaded quality to Gaia as I experience her. And I don't know where that association is coming from, but that sort of arises. It's not a plan that I had in mind. It's just, oh, there's a personality there. And, I guess if you're familiar with internal family systems, I think this is very similar in a particular way to internal family systems, of assigning parts in one's own psyche as having things to say, like they are beings, and then you have a conversation with them. This is incredibly similar. It's just that it's projected into the world, and it's interacted with in the world. But it doesn't feel like it's projected. It feels like there's a tuning in, and then I can hear what Gaia has to say, but not in words. Although I will emphasize, some people are really good at getting these kinds of energies to, they can hand their language center over to the frequency, and then the frequency can talk. I don't really know how to do that. I'm really good at using my language center, and I'm pretty tenacious about holding on to it. I don't know how to I don't know how to hand the microphone over to those frequencies yet. I might be able to eventually. But the effect is that I can't get language for the most part. I don't get words, but some people can. Um, the point of all of this is that there's a very playful way that um, like, so for instance, in my own life, one of the things that I've come to notice very vividly is like for a whole host of reasons, I noticed, oh, I think the key to unlocking a bunch of my life is going to be attuning to the resonance of Venus. So I started doing that. I started doing some ceremonies and playing some music. I particularly like Gustav Holst's The Planets. He's got one for each of the planets based on him talking to an astrologer friend of his. And so the resonance type is meant to be of the planets as gods. So when he plays this music piece of Venus, it's actually referring to mythological Venus rather than to the planet Venus. And it's a lovely piece. It's very evocative of Venus. And so feeling into that and feeling into the nature of how desire is in my own body and in my heart, and what does it mean for, and not as an intellectual exercise, but feeling into that frequency. What does it mean that I am attuning to the goddess of love? In feeling that, I've noticed that a lot of the things in the world around me, so the actual experience is something of synchronicities happening a lot more that are on the same wavelength as Venus, in a way that I'll probably talk about in one of these days. Shortly after attuning to Venus this way, a major keystone of how to work with sexual energy just dropped in my lap. I feel like I've been looking for this for decades, and now I feel like I understand erotic energy, and I can embody how that can move through my body in a way that respects my manifestation and respects other people and the whole context, but is also ferocious. There's a wonderful mix there. I wasn't looking for that. It was more, this was exactly in tune with the kind of feel I was getting for what attuning to Venus is like. And this is just one example of a whole bunch of them. It took like 3 days for that to just suddenly appear, like a multi-decade-old puzzle just being solved. There were a whole bunch of other things that that just showed up all at the same time, like a particular. Every now and then it feels almost like the actual lived experience is almost like the goddess is actually a conscious being who is giving me a wink. I had long associated Venus with rose scent, and then a bunch of things that happened to come with rose scents just suddenly started showing up. Not just like, and this is definitely not selective perception, or what is it, confirmation bias, because I didn't have anything having to do with rose scents at all before then, and then all of a sudden a bunch of rose stuff just dropped in my lap. I wasn't telling people about this. It was just like, here we go. There is something about, I mean, there is some confirmation bias about, well, why am I picking that and not something else? But but what I'm trying to describe here is the lived experience of, well, when attuning like this, what is the actual encounter with the world shaped like? And a lot of the things that I was trying to work with that had me think, oh, attuning to Venus is actually going to be really helpful. For reasons I'm not going to go into here, I had a pretty strong suspicion that this would help with a lot of my my ongoing tendencies for my body to get hurt, and particularly the way that my body would get hurt from the intensity that I liked to exercise, and feeling like, well, I need an outlet for this energy, but I can't. Like, what do I do? And I got an answer to that. I got a very clear answer to that. And it was, very loosely speaking, it's from what Venus told me. So now I can step out of that perspective, that sort of mythic perspective, and focus on uh, like popping back into the physicalist, like the materialist scientific paradigm, and go, well, okay, so what's going on? What's really going on? Because we know what reality is. What's really going on is that uh, there's a thing that would have there was an angle that would like donning this perspective helped me to shift how I was viewing things, which allowed for a kind of creativity that wasn't available to me before. But because of how I shifted my frame, I experienced that creativity as interacting with some kind of being. That's a story that I told myself, but in fact, what's really going on is just a different use of creative faculties in interacting with the world. It's a frame shift. So great. Perhaps that is even correct, but that way of thinking doesn't let me do it. And if I cling to that way of thinking, it blocks me from doing it. So this is, again, one of those things of this is part of why I think it's useful to be able to loosen the grip on believing. Like, I found it to be enormously important to basically let go of the tenacious belief that I know what real means. It doesn't mean that I don't have guesses, but it does mean that I don't pretend that my guesses mean I'm right. I acknowledge what I actually know, which is basically nothing. But within that nothing, I have some ideas of what I think is consistent. Thinking that way makes it really easy to slip into a framework of believing in gods. When I say believe, I mean something enacted rather than something cognitive. I can live the interaction with gods, with intelligences, with plant spirits, with well, spirits in general. There's a way of living in kind of an animistic world, or being able to shift into the perspectives of others, like I was talking about earlier. That becomes very fluid for me because I'm not tenaciously grabbing onto them. But at the same time, I don't believe those frames either. I'm not saying, well, science doesn't know it's true, so I'm not going to believe it. I'm instead going to believe this other crazy thing. Nope. Nope. I don't know what real is. That's true. I don't think anyone knows what real is. I'm just being honest about that with myself. And that gives me a kind of flexibility. It gives me an enormous amount of power to make meaning. And being able to make meaning lets me do a kind of magic. If I can cure my physical difficulties by, in effect, praying to a goddess, and that it works, and I can see why it works, and that produces the results that I'm expecting, well, I mean, it's helpful to be able to fit that into a particular paradigm, I guess. It gives you some kind of sense of security or safety. But also it just works. So I use it. So, yeah. So I didn't actually, like coming on to talk about this, this is a little bit of like dipping my toes in the waters of, well, how, like I'm wanting to work with and sort of burn away this part of me that is so concerned with how people see me and whether people consider me to be a sensible person, and whether I am sane enough to listen to. Because I don't find that that concern is at all helpful. And I'm not interested in persuading people who are trying to judge me that way that I am sane. If I'm concerned about it, that muddies, like I'm more interested in having a certain impression or impact on people than I am in being clear about what I see and how I see it. I think that being clear has a better shot at conveying the truth of what I have to say, and at conveying the crazy that I carry. Like I'm guaranteed to be out of touch with reality in some fashion. That's basically like what it means to exist. So part of it is just, in some sense, trying to give the parts of me that are not in alignment with truth an opportunity to be obliterated. But real truth, like the truth of reality, not the truth of a model. I don't care that much about the truth of models. Like, models are tools. What's true? Okay? That's not for intellectual discussion. That's a matter of reality. And so this is me, like this whole topic is me sort of going a little bit farther than I have before in stepping into the water and going, okay, look, I play with this. This is some of the dance that I do. And I expect that some people are going to listen to this and decide that I've gone off the deep end, or it's going to confirm their suspicions of me. Cool. That's exactly how it should be. I don't claim it's not. I don't claim that it's comfortable for me, but the discomfort is, as the Marines say, pain is weakness leaving the body. Embarrassment is falsehood leaving the soul. So, I didn't come on here intending to teach how to do this. My guess is that if you want to know, you can probably figure it out. But again, it's not an intellectual thing. It's the same way of, well, you know, there's a way to tell the difference between genres of music. You sort of feel it into it. There's kind of a way to tell the difference between the resonance of pleasure versus the resonance of force of will. Right? That's more the flavor of Mars. Like if you want to be able to tune into, like, well, like, how do I tell what the flavor is, like the energetic flavor is of my tea? Well, don't use mixed teas. There are too many flavors in there. You could do a diet if you want to. It's a little brutal. But just really paying attention before I bite into this apple. In fact, before I touch the apple, how do I feel? Get really sensitive. And then touch the apple. What changes? Smell it. What changes? What's changing from your thoughts versus from the experience of the apple? What's coming from the apple? I think it's just a matter of paying attention. I imagine that's hard at first, but that's really all there is to it. You just pay attention, and then after a while you start to notice. Or you take something that is intensely strong that can't not announce itself because its frequency is too loud. Like ayahuasca. Okay, so I feel pretty complete here. So coming back to this, Rupert asking about any opinions about psychiatric medications. Yeah, there are a couple of things that feel associated to me about that. The first one is, as far as I can tell, I'm going to tell you my impressions. This is not backed by statistics. I haven't done anything like investigate the evidence of this in much detail. I haven't had a ton of conversations with psychiatrists or manufacturers. I have had a fair number of conversations with people with different psychiatric disorders. My father used to work in a psychiatric hospital, and he had a lot of experience specifically with schizophrenics. So I've gotten a lot of stories from there. I have a lot of pieces of information and a lot of impressions, but I don't have what I would consider well-researched knowledge. So I'll share my impressions, and please take them with that context. My impression is almost all psychiatric medications are overprescribed. I don't mean that they don't help the people that they're given to. What I mean is something more like there's so much incentive for um, for psychiatrists to prescribe these medications that it's become part of the groundwater. It's really, I mean, in some cases literally, but I didn't mean that part. Um, but it's like um, like SSRIs, for instance, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the classic thing for antidepressants. SSRIs are in a particular way biologically addictive. Um, I don't think they usually talk about it quite this way, but there's a withdrawal period. You have to be careful with how quickly you ramp it up, and then once you're on SSRIs, when you leave them, a bunch of the symptoms are the same symptoms as depression, even if you didn't have depression before. Um, the the thing is that when you're prescribing an SSRI to deal with depression, um, so if it's a lot harder to justify than I think a lot of doctors emphasize. I'm going to pick on this one first because I happen to know a decent amount about how SSRIs work, and I have bumped into some of the statistics around this one. Um, the Although bear in mind, all information is crap. So, like I may have been fed lies dressed up as statistics, but I'm given to understand that if somebody is suicidally depressed and you give them an SSRI, there is actually an increased risk of suicide. Part of the guessed reason for this is that the SSRI removes something like the lack of capacity to do, but it doesn't address the suicidality. Okay, so somebody may have been avoiding killing themselves because they were too depressed to do anything about their desire to die. And then you give them an SSRI, and guess what's fixed? Oops. So it's really hard to justify using an SSRI as an emergency intervention for somebody who is dangerously depressed, because it seems like, well, what do you mean by dangerous? If you mean to their own lives, then it looks like the evidence actually points in the opposite direction. So then is the claim that there is just something wrong with their brains? There probably are some people who have some sort of serotonin production problem, or their brain takes up the serotonin too quickly. I guess that's possible. It seems like the type of thing that I would expect if it's at all, if it's genetic. How the hell did that survive the evolutionary filter? But let's suppose it did, and my hand wavy evopsych is just terrible, and then there's some sort of brain glitch. Then I guess it sort of makes sense for somebody to be on life-term SSRIs, although it's going to totally have weird side effects. But almost every time, from what I can tell, what's going on with depression is some variation of something that matters is being deeply violated in a way that feels systematic to the person. This is like a dramatic version of the freeze and fall response. I would expect that if we had a culture where if you gave people 5-MeO-DMT instead of SSRIs, I bet that we would have a much vaster cure rate for depression. But there is also there's an incentive in the pharmaceutical industry to not cure diseases. It's much more profitable to have something that somebody needs to take on a regular basis for the rest of their lives. You don't even need to imagine scheming people plotting with like twirling mustaches in the background about this. I don't mean to suggest something conspiratorial, although I do think that that happens more than we're inclined to culturally think, but less than some subcultures think. But all you need is for this incentive to be in place, and then there'll be a tendency, you'll just find this drift where people who are doing the research or people who are marketing or just find themselves a little less interested in trying to push that direction because like, well, we don't really know how to cure depression, do we? But this works, so let me give you this cure. And the fact that that's giving them money gives them a little bit of an incentive to not look at what part of themselves they're not paying attention to, where they're being a little less than truthful with themselves and with the world. So it just creates this incentive structure where you can have a whole bunch of people who are very well intentioned, who are just slightly less than enlightened, who end up promoting people needing to be on SSRIs for over long periods of time. Oops. So I think, and I'm focusing on depression. I know that there are lots of others to pay attention to. There are antipsychotics, and there's people who are, like when people have issues with ADHD, there are ways of usually using dopaminergic psychiatric medications, which is to say it produces dopamine in the brain. I may have them confused, but I think Ritalin is an example. It's been a long time since I went through the names for these, but Ritalin, I think, is a dopaminergic substance. And but again, I would look at that and go, well, I mean, how real is this thing that you're calling ADHD? Like maybe there are some cases where people are really actually dysfunctional, but I think what you actually mean is that the natural way that some people work does not operate very well the way in the narrow parameters that our culture insists all people should behave, and then that gets called a disorder. And it is a disorder in the sense that if somebody doesn't have the flexibility to match the culture around them, then they are dysfunctional with respect to the culture. But to say that that means that they need to medicate their brains, I mean, maybe we could learn from them instead. Because, I mean, how much band-aiding do we want to do? I'm not quite sure how antipsychotics work, so I can't really speak to those. But when I'm tracking what little I know about psychiatric medications, my impression is that a lot of the tendency to prescribe them in the first place is coming from a broken incentive structure in the background, and the people involved in those systems not having enough internal clarity to recognize that they are corruptible, or what being corrupted actually feels like. So they end up pressing something that doesn't actually make sense on a large scale and definitely isn't in the best long-term interest of the individuals involved. With that said, I don't mean to deny the existence of people who really do need these medications, and I think that there's a lot of value in being able to give them that. But most of my impression is that most of the time what's going on with psychiatric medications is ignorance of how to deal with trauma and a broken incentive structure around pharmaceuticals most of the time. Rupert says, my drug is a dopamine antagonist, and after taking it for 20 years, my brain has grown extra dopamine receptors, so withdrawing causes difficulties. Yeah. Yep. That is how that works. The same thing happens with SSRIs. People end up having a kind of feedback loop in terms of how their serotonin receptors work, which results in in effect, SSRIs make it so that there's more serotonin going around in the system, so it forces the brain to pretend that the serotonin levels are higher for good reasons, because the brain produced them, which tends to cause, I may have the mechanism backwards, but I think this is correct. It tends to cause fewer receptors or weakened receptors for serotonin in the brain, which means that if you stop using the SSRI, your brain is worse at picking up on the serotonin that's in the brain, so it feels like the levels are even lower than they were before. The same thing happens with caffeine, frankly. Caffeine is basically an adenosine reuptake inhibitor. So I mean, in some sense, it's the reverse here. And I may have, like I said, I may have gotten the mechanism for SSRIs backwards. But with caffeine, you actually end up growing more adenosine receptors. And adenosine, when your brain gets adenosine in one of its receptors, it's a kind of a tiredness thing that shows up. So when you come off of caffeine, what happens is you have all of these adenosine receptors. You have extra adenosine receptors. So when the adenosine lands on the receptors, you feel really tired. Normally, I don't remember whether it's caffeine or something that caffeine produces, because I don't think caffeine crosses the blood-brain barrier. I don't remember exactly, but anyway, there's something, let's just pretend it's caffeine, that just sits on the adenosine receptor and blocks the adenosine from entering. Like, that's how caffeine works. Yeah, this is a pretty standard thing. It turns out that if you try to adjust a dynamic, self-adjusting metabolic system by tweaking one parameter, it turns out that the whole system is dynamic and tries to adjust. So if you don't understand the whole system, then stop pretending you can do surgery to it. That's a comment about the culture rather than a comment about somebody who's taking the psychiatric medications. I also want to emphasize, I don't know your particular case, Rupert, and I don't mean to say that you should get off of your medications, because I don't know. I really don't. And you ask my opinion about psychiatric medications, and that's where I currently have my impression sitting. Okay, so I was talking about gods and talking to spirits and resonances, and then we'll just add 20-ish minutes of talking about psychiatric medications. So there we go. Well, that's what happened here. I'm going to wrap up now. Yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll sign on again tomorrow.